In the desolate rail yard, Officer Chris Brown mercilessly tied Ellie Taylor to the tracks, unaware that her father, a black belt martial arts master, was on his way to rescue her. How will the intense showdown between justice and evil unfold? Will the father's strength and determination, along with Ellie's unbreakable spirit, be enough to turn the tide? Don't miss a single moment until justice is served. Subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Ellie Taylor is an outstanding researcher in the field of biotechnology. At 28, she has achieved remarkable accomplishments due to her intelligence and relentless determination. Known for her sharp intellect and compassionate heart, Ellie stands out not only as a scientist, but also as an inspiring figure in her community. Every day, she works in an advanced laboratory, developing medical diagnostic methods that make healthcare more accessible and affordable. Her research is not just a job, but a profound passion driven by her desire to improve the lives of those lacking access to medical care. After work, Ellie often spends time at a local youth center where she teaches young girls self-defense. With strong ideals, Ellie doesn't just teach them self-defense techniques. She also encourages them to pursue their dreams, reminding them of the importance of self-confidence and determination. She shares the valuable lessons she learned from her father, Joseph Taylor, who imparted much more than just self-defense skills. He showed her the power of courage and integrity. Joseph Taylor, Ellie's father, is a well-respected figure in the community. He was once a professional martial artist and served as a combat trainer for the military. After leaving the military, Joseph opened a small dojo in the city's suburbs, where he teaches self-defense to children from disadvantaged areas. To him, teaching isn't just about martial arts. It's about instilling confidence and inner strength in these young individuals. He believes that helping them learn how to protect themselves is essential, especially when they live in a world filled with injustices and hardships. Joseph is known for his calm demeanor, sharp gaze, and dignified presence. With just one look, one could sense his inner strength and unwavering will. Decades of martial arts training have equipped him with not only excellent combat skills but also a resilient spirit and remarkable emotional control. He has a keen sense of people, an ability to perceive danger, and a readiness to protect those he loves. To Ellie, Joseph is a mentor, a friend, and a guardian. His steadfastness and loyalty have deeply inspired her, helping her become an independent, strong woman. She knows that the values her father instilled in her will always be an essential part of her life. Every self-defense lesson, every story of resilience he shared with her from a young age has not only become a memory, but also a guiding principle that shaped who she is today. In her work, Ellie never forgets her father's teachings. She recalls how he emphasized the importance of staying calm in difficult situations and his advice to always keep a clear mind and believe in herself. These words of wisdom have helped Ellie remain steadfast both in life and in her work, where she faces numerous challenges in researching and developing new medical methods. Ellie and Joseph are a remarkable father-daughter duo bonded by mutual trust and respect. Their relationship is not just familial, but also that of comrades. They have endured many ups and downs together and understand that real strength lies not in physical power, but in the will and determination to protect what they cherish most. That night, after completing her work in the lab, Ellie Taylor stepped out onto the street, her steps weary, yet her heart at peace. She decided to take a familiar shortcut home, passing through an industrial area near the railroad tracks. Though this route was shorter, it tended to be deserted at night. However, Ellie was familiar with the path and felt confident, especially with the self-defense skills her father had taught her since childhood. But tonight felt different. As she walked through the dim light cast by the scattered street lamps, Ellie sensed something off in the air, a subtle, lurking threat. She stayed calm, breathing steadily, and quickened her pace. Thanks to her father's teachings, she knew to keep her senses alert when walking alone in quiet areas, especially after dark. As Ellie neared the abandoned tracks, she noticed a man leaning casually against the railing, though something was unsettling about him. He wore a police uniform, yet his demeanor didn't resemble that of an officer on duty. It was Chris Brown, a cop with a notorious reputation. In the area, he was known for his excessive harshness and occasional acts of cruelty. Rumors about him extended beyond strict law enforcement, hinting at a tendency for racial discrimination, especially against those he deemed out of place. Ellie kept walking, hoping to avoid his attention, but Brown noticed her and quickly stepped in her path, blocking her way. A cold smirk crossed his face, and the look in his eyes made Ellie feel his intimidation as clearly as if he had spoken it. "Out this late, are we?" Chris's voice was low and taunting. He dragged out his words, infusing them with a hint of contempt and menace. There was nothing of a protective officer's tone in his voice, only the arrogance of someone exerting his authority over another. Ellie met his gaze, keeping her expression calm even as unease grew inside her. She knew how to maintain composure in such situations. "I'm just heading home, officer," she replied, her voice steady and firm. She recalled her father's lessons. Stay calm and never let fear cloud your judgment. Ellie knew that any sign of fear could make things worse, but Brown wasn't letting her go so easily. He smirked, stepping closer, his gaze sweeping over her with a blatant disdain. "You know, this isn't exactly a safe area, especially for someone like you, don't you?" His words were laced with insinuation, suggesting she didn't belong here, that she had no right to be here. His tone and gaze made it clear he saw her as inferior. Ellie remained calm, responding in an even but firm tone. "Thank you for your concern, but I'll be fine." She refused to show any weakness in his presence. Yet, deep down, Ellie knew she was facing a real threat. Her response seemed to only aggravate Chris Brown. Suddenly, he grabbed her arm, gripping it tightly enough for her to feel the pain. "Did you think you'd just walk by without any trouble?" His voice dropped, almost a whisper, but the menace was unmistakable. His eyes no longer held the look of a law enforcer, but that of a predator eyeing its prey. Ellie tried to stay calm, pulling back slightly, attempting to free her arm from his grasp. "Let me go," she demanded, her tone resolute, though tinged with apprehension. She knew that any rash actions now could worsen the situation, but she couldn't simply let him overpower her. Brown's smirk grew more sinister at her resistance. He pulled her closer, his tone dripping with malice. "You think you can just walk away after a few words?" With a forceful yank, he began dragging Ellie toward the tracks, disregarding her struggle and pleas. In Ellie's mind, her father's words echoed, along with the self-defense techniques he had taught her. Yet she was acutely aware that her strength was no match for Chris Brown's aggression and authority. At this moment, Ellie realized she was facing a truly dangerous man, someone who wasn't just a police officer but a corrupted figure who used his power to harm others. She gritted her teeth, determined not to let him intimidate her completely. Deep inside, she knew she had to resist and find a way to escape. But, amidst the tense and foreboding atmosphere, that task seemed daunting. Despite her fear, Ellie kept a fierce glint in her eyes, silently promising herself that she would not let Chris Brown win easily. She knew she would have to summon every ounce of courage and find even the smallest opportunity to survive this night. As Ellie struggled desperately with Chris Brown, not far away, Joseph Taylor received an emergency signal from his daughter's smartwatch. This alert feature had been set up between him and Ellie in case she ever faced danger. The beeping sound of the alert jolted Joseph into action, immediately filling him with dread about what might be happening to Ellie. Without hesitation, he grabbed his car keys and rushed out of the house, speeding toward the industrial area where Ellie often passed on her way home. On the way, Joseph tried to stay calm, but his mind was plagued with worst-case scenarios. However, his car suddenly made a strange noise and slowed down. A minor malfunction forced him to stop briefly, further fueling his anxiety. After quickly fixing the issue, he resumed driving, racing down the dim streets. When the only shortcut to reach Ellie's location was unexpectedly blocked by a temporary construction barrier, Joseph knew he couldn't waste any more time. Leaving his car behind, he sprinted through alleys and winding roads leading to the location of his daughter's signal. His heart raced as he imagined the dangers Ellie might be facing, but his instincts as a father and seasoned fighter drove him forward. As he ran, he recalled the techniques he had taught Ellie, hoping she could hold her ground until he arrived. Joseph finally managed to bypass the temporary barriers, sprinting through the dark alleys. His hurried footsteps echoed in the silence, each beat a reminder of his urgency and fear of arriving too late. Images of Ellie, strong yet now likely in a terrifying situation, flooded his mind. He knew he had to reach her in time, no matter the obstacles. Approaching the railroad area, Joseph saw the flashing lights of an approaching train in the distance, making the urgency of each second painfully clear. The scene he came upon felt like a nightmare. Ellie was tied down on the tracks, helpless and terrified, while Chris Brown, the power-abusing officer, stood over her with a smug, chilling satisfaction. The fear in Joseph's heart transformed instantly into a raging fury. This wasn't a protector of the public, but a cruel predator reveling in his control. "Let her go," Joseph shouted, his voice resounding with authority and anger. Chris turned around, a flash of surprise on his face, quickly replaced by a mocking smirk. "Ah, another heroic father? How pitiful." Chris sneered, unaffected by Joseph's arrival. He seemed convinced he could easily overpower anyone, especially an older man. But Chris underestimated Joseph. This was not just any father. Joseph was a seasoned martial artist, prepared to do whatever it took to protect his daughter. At that moment, his instincts as a fighter and a father ignited, and he lunged forward to confront Chris. The clash was intense. Chris, full of arrogance, didn't anticipate that his opponent was a man trained for dangerous encounters. Joseph struck quickly, targeting Chris's weak points, catching him off guard. But Chris, surprised yet stubborn, fought back with a menacing determination. Drawing a knife from his pocket, he advanced, the blade glinting under the faint light. Recognizing the danger, Joseph immediately switched to a defensive stance, keeping a safe distance while assessing every move his opponent made. Chris lunged forward with the knife aimed at Joseph, but Joseph sidestepped, sweeping Chris's leg and causing him to stumble. Chris quickly recovered, now more furious than before, swinging the knife with reckless aggression. Joseph skillfully blocked the attacks and, spotting an opening, grabbed Chris's wrist, twisting it sharply until the knife clattered to the ground. Yet Chris refused to yield. Using the last of his strength, Chris attempted to punch Joseph, but Joseph dodged just in time and delivered a powerful blow to Chris's chest. Winded, Chris stumbled, gasping for breath, but his resolve didn't break. He charged again, blinded by rage, trying to push Joseph away from Ellie. With precise timing, Joseph maneuvered behind Chris, locking his arm in a restraining hold he had perfected over years of training. A sharp crack echoed as Chris's arm was immobilized, and he collapsed in agony, unable to resist any longer. Joseph threw him to the ground with finality, rendering him defenseless. Without a moment to lose, Joseph rushed to Ellie's side, his hands trembling as he began untying the ropes binding her. The approaching train's light grew brighter, the rumbling sound louder. Sweat beaded on Joseph's forehead as he worked quickly to undo each knot, praying he could free her in time. Ellie, though shaken, tried to stay calm and assist her father, even as her swollen, bound wrists throbbed. "Dad, the train's getting closer," she whispered, her voice wavering, eyes fixed on the approaching light. Joseph didn't reply, focusing intently on the ropes, knowing each second counted. Finally, with one last effort, he untied the final knot, pulling Ellie off the tracks just moments before the train roared past, its horn blaring and wheels grinding against the rails. Joseph enveloped Ellie in his arms, holding her tightly. He could feel her heart pounding against his chest, but she was safe now. They stood there, wrapped in each other's embrace, taking deep breaths to steady themselves after the harrowing ordeal. Joseph's anger simmered beneath his relief, but the knowledge that Ellie was safe brought a sense of calm. "I'm here now, sweetheart. It's over," he murmured, his voice warm and full of love. Ellie clung to her father, feeling the security and strength he provided. Chris Brown lay defeated on the ground, groaning in pain and humiliation. For Joseph and Ellie, though, the battle wasn't over. They knew they would have to face the legal system, to confront those who would try to shield people like Chris. But in that moment, as father and daughter held each other close, they understood that they would never back down, and they would fight to the end to protect each other and to seek justice. The sound of police sirens shattered the tense silence, just as Joseph managed to pull Ellie away from the tracks. Red and blue lights flashed across the desolate industrial area as a patrol car screeched to a halt nearby. Officer Richard, a young rookie, stepped out, his face a mixture of suspicion and confusion as he took in the scene before him. Richard's gaze landed on Ellie, whose wrists bore visible bruises, swollen and still bleeding slightly. Nearby, Chris Brown sat on the ground, scowling in pain from his dislocated shoulder after the confrontation with Joseph. Richard's confusion deepened as he asked, "What's going on here?" His voice was tinged with both concern and uncertainty. Joseph, still catching his breath and visibly furious, prepared to explain, but Chris interjected, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he pointed accusingly, "I was attacked. I was only doing my job when these two ambushed me." His story might have sounded plausible if not for the terrified look in Ellie's eyes and the clear marks on her wrists. Richard's eyes shifted back to Ellie, lingering on the painful evidence of restraint, and he sensed something deeply amiss. This didn't look like an ordinary scuffle. Richard's gaze returned to Chris, but now there was a hint of doubt, as if he was beginning to question the story of his superior. Moments later, Sergeant William Shatner arrived on the scene, his experienced eyes quickly scanning every detail. A seasoned officer, Shatner had seen his fair share of injustice within the force, and knew well that the truth could often be obscured behind uniforms. Not every officer was worthy of the badge they wore. Richard quickly reported his initial findings to Shatner, pointing out Ellie's injuries. Shatner listened carefully, his gaze resting on Chris for a long moment, before turning to Ellie with genuine concern. Calmly, but with a firm edge, he asked, "Ms. Taylor, can you tell me what happened?" Ellie took a deep breath, steadying herself as she met Shatner's gaze. Her voice shook, but she spoke, recounting how Chris Brown had blocked her path, threatened her under the guise of authority, and ultimately tied her to the tracks, leaving her as. The train approached. As she described the ordeal, her voice softened, revealing the trauma she had endured. Shatner listened intently, his face stoic but his eyes growing colder as he glanced back at Chris. "Brown, do you have an explanation for this?" he asked, his tone calm yet authoritative. Chris, still in pain from his encounter with Joseph, tried to keep up his confidence. "I was just doing my job, and they attacked me," he insisted, but the conviction in his voice wavered. Shatner studied Chris for a long, silent moment. His instincts, honed over years, told him something was wrong. Turning to Richard, he ordered, "Check the area. Look for anything unusual." Richard immediately moved to the tracks, where he found a length of rope stained with dried blood, tangible evidence supporting Ellie's story. As Richard held up the bloodied rope, Shatner shot Chris a look of sharp disappointment and suspicion. "So, Brown," he said, his voice heavy with disapproval, "do you have an explanation for this?" Chris faltered, his eyes wide, beginning to realize his fabricated story was falling apart. Turning back to Joseph and Ellie, Shatner's eyes reflected both resolve and compassion. "I will see that this is handled properly," he said, his voice resolute. "We will gather all the evidence and bring clarity to this case. No one is above the law, not even a police officer." Richard and his colleagues swiftly began collecting evidence. They took photos of the rope, documented Ellie's bruises, and recorded Joseph's testimony of what he had witnessed. As Ellie recounted the details, her voice was steady but determined, refusing to let Chris escape accountability. Before leaving the scene, Shatner approached Joseph and Ellie, his tone a mix of sympathy and conviction. "Rest assured, both of you, I will ensure that this case is handled fairly. We'll conduct a thorough investigation and bring the justice you deserve." Ellie looked at Shatner, her eyes filled with gratitude. Though she had just endured a harrowing ordeal, she no longer felt alone in this battle. Richard and Shatner's actions showed her that there were still people willing to stand on the side of truth, even if it meant challenging their own. Shatner ordered Chris's detention and began organizing statements from all parties involved. He turned back to Joseph and Ellie, his gaze unwavering. "I will make sure we have a fair and unbiased investigation. Brown, you will face the consequences of your actions." Joseph nodded, holding Ellie's hand tightly, feeling a glimmer of justice piercing through the darkness of the night. Though he knew the road ahead would be challenging, he and Ellie felt strengthened by the support of allies like Shatner and Richard, officers who were committed to upholding justice and standing with those seeking the truth. The investigation into Chris Brown's misconduct was intensifying, with mounting evidence against him. Ellie's bruised wrists, the blood-stained rope found on the tracks, and witness testimonies all pointed to serious abuse of power. But just as everything seemed to be progressing, Captain Ryan Giggs, a high-ranking officer known for fiercely defending the department's image, arrived, casting a cold, tense air over the inquiry. Giggs was a powerful figure within the police department, determined to shield its reputation. Entering the interrogation room, where Ellie, Joseph, Richard, and Shatner sat, he surveyed them with a steely gaze, as if ready to crush any threat to the department's image. In Giggs's mind, Chris Brown was a fellow officer who needed protection, regardless of the evidence. "This whole thing is an unfortunate misunderstanding," Giggs began, his tone calm but resolute. "You must understand that these accusations aren't trivial. They carry consequences that could deeply impact the department's reputation." Turning to Ellie and Joseph, he added, "Do you two realize you're facing a system that fiercely protects its own?" Joseph felt the veiled threat in Giggs's words, but he didn't waver. He met Giggs's stare with an unwavering gaze of his own. "You may protect someone like Chris Brown, but you can't protect his actions. My daughter suffered a horrific attack, and we won't be silenced," Joseph declared, his voice filled with determination. Giggs smirked, unimpressed by Joseph's resilience. "Mr. Taylor, you seem not to understand. This system isn't for the weak. Officer Brown has served here for years. Your allegations could be reconsidered, and I advise you to think carefully before pushing forward." Ellie, pale yet resolute, refused to let Giggs intimidate her. "I almost lost my life because of the man you're protecting. You can cover for him all you want, but the truth is undeniable. We have evidence, and we'll keep fighting." Narrowing his eyes, Giggs replied, "Ms. Taylor, it seems you misunderstand your position. This department isn't a place for baseless accusations rooted in personal emotion. I suggest you stay silent and let us handle this matter internally." At that, Richard stood up, showing no fear toward his superior. "Captain Giggs, I was there and witnessed what happened. Those bruises on Ms. Taylor's wrists are no misunderstanding. We cannot ignore such wrongful actions. To do so would betray the core purpose of our duty, to uphold truth and justice." Shatner joined in, his patience for Giggs wearing thin. "Captain, we must seek the truth. If what Ms. Taylor says is accurate, then Officer Brown's actions are more than wrong. They're criminal. If we fail to address this, we're betraying the public's trust in our profession." Giggs shot Shatner a frosty smile. "You both seem to forget that incidents like this are often handled internally to avoid harm to the department's reputation." "Heroics won't advance your careers," he warned coldly. But Shatner stood firm. "Justice isn't something we compromise. Ms. Taylor deserves protection, and we won't abandon that simply to preserve someone's reputation. Without truth, there's no real honor." Giggs glanced between them, seeing that neither Richard nor Shatner would be easily intimidated. Finally, he shrugged, his tone bitter as he said, "Fine. If you want to continue this investigation, be my guest. But don't say I didn't warn you. This system will defend its own, and you'll both face the consequences if things don't go as planned." With a final icy look at Ellie and Joseph, Giggs turned on his heel and left, as though his parting words would be enough to scare them into submission. But instead, the room felt more unified in his absence. Ellie turned to Richard and Shatner, feeling bolstered by their steadfast support. "Thank you," she said softly but sincerely. "I don't know if I could face this without your help." Richard placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, offering a gentle smile. "You're not alone, Ellie. Justice must prevail, and we're here to make sure it does." Shatner nodded, his gaze softening. "This isn't just our duty. It's a responsibility each of us in this field carries. We won't let anyone suffer from such wrongdoing without protection." Ellie and Joseph knew the fight was far from over, but with Richard and Shatner's unwavering support, they felt empowered to face the challenges that lay ahead. Though the journey to justice would be long and challenging, They were resolved to keep pushing forward, fighting for truth and their honor. In the packed courtroom, all eyes were fixed on Ellie and the plaintiff's attorney, Sandra Smith, who was ready to begin her opening statement. Sandra understood that this case was more than a personal grievance. It was a fight against abuse of power and injustice within the legal system. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Sandra began, her voice resonant and steady, filling the silent room with authority. "Today, we aren't simply dealing with a crime. We're confronting the dark reality of how power can be abused and how the vulnerable, like Ms. Ellie Taylor, suffer the consequences of that abuse." Sandra recounted every detail of the incident, from the moment Chris Brown approached Ellie to his ruthless act of tying her to the tracks. She described the rope marks etched into Ellie's wrists and her terror as the train approached, with each word hammering into the hearts of all who listened. Officer Chris Brown used his position not to protect, but to harm, Sandra continued, her gaze locked onto the jury. He violated not only his professional ethics, but the very duty entrusted to him. His actions weren't a simple lapse in judgment. They were deliberate, malicious, and unforgivable. Her words stirred a quiet fury within the room. Joseph, sitting beside Ellie, felt every powerful word, squeezing his daughter's hand in support. The jury members listened intently, some even lowering their gaze as the details struck a chord. As Sandra paused, tension filled the room. Then Carl Benson, Chris's defense attorney, stood up, exuding a cool confidence. Moving to the center of the courtroom, he tried to impose a sense of calm, in stark contrast to the charged atmosphere Sandra had created. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Carl began smoothly, "you must understand that my client, Chris Brown, is a long-serving police officer with an impeccable record. Any actions he may have taken were only in the interest of maintaining security." He attempted to downplay Ellie's testimony, suggesting that she might have misinterpreted the situation in a moment of panic. He emphasized that Ellie had never faced such a scenario before and might have exaggerated the incident's severity. "Consider carefully," Carl urged with smug assurance. "Chris Brown has dedicated years to law enforcement, performing his duty diligently. These accusations are not just a misunderstanding. They are an unjust attack on the integrity of a devoted officer." Carl's words left many in the courtroom visibly disturbed. His defense of Chris wasn't just an attempt to exonerate his client. It was a direct affront to Ellie, who had endured a horrific ordeal. He leaned on Chris's record as though it could excuse such brutality, leaving the audience feeling the bitter weight of injustice. Ellie remained silent, her face a mixture of pain and anger as she listened to Carl's words. But seeing Sandra's resolute expression reminded her that she wasn't alone in this fight. Sandra refused to let Carl's words obscure the truth. Rising to her feet, she countered with unwavering confidence. "Attorney Benson would have you believe that a spotless service record can erase misconduct, but no amount of record can justify using authority to harm others. Justice does not protect those who abuse power, and we must shield the public from individuals like him." Sandra went on to dismantle each of Carl's points, focusing on the undeniable evidence and witness accounts supporting Ellie's claims. She reminded the jury of the testimonies from officers Richard and Shatner, both of whom had witnessed the truth and stood against the injustice despite systemic pressure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sandra concluded, her voice steady with conviction, "today we have the chance to affirm that justice prevails, that no one stands above the law, and that those who abuse their power like Chris Brown, cannot escape accountability. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Jury members exchanged thoughtful glances, some looking at Ellie with understanding, recognizing that her stand was not only for herself, but for justice and protection for all. The silence was profound as everyone pondered the question of whether true justice would be served. After both sides presented their arguments, the court recessed for deliberation. Ellie and Joseph sat together, hopeful yet anxious. Sandra placed a reassuring hand on Ellie's shoulder, conveying strength. "The verdict will come soon, Ellie," Sandra said gently. "Regardless of the outcome, you fought with bravery and resilience. You've done everything to defend the truth." Ellie looked up, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I won't ever give up," she replied firmly. "No matter the outcome, I believe the truth will prevail." Now, as the legal battle neared its end, everyone in the courtroom felt that this case had transcended individual stakes. It had become a wake-up call for the system. Would justice truly prevail, or would it remain concealed under the shield of power? After tense moments, the long-awaited moment finally arrived. Everyone in the courtroom held their breath as the jury returned, their faces serious and solemn after intense deliberation. Ellie tightly gripped Joseph's hand, her heart brimming with both hope and anxiety. She knew that the events of the next few minutes would determine not only her future, but also the triumph of fairness and justice. The judge looked at the jury and asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The jury, a forewoman, a calm, middle-aged woman, stood and nodded, her clear voice resonating in the heavy silence of the courtroom. "Your Honor, we have reached a verdict." She took a deep breath and delivered each word with unhesitating precision. "For the charges of attempted murder, assault, and blatant abuse of power, we find the defendant, Chris Brown, guilty." A murmur spread through the courtroom and a collective sigh of relief echoed from various corners. Those present had hoped for a fair verdict, and as the judge read the sentence, they felt justice gradually being restored. Ellie squeezed her father Joseph's hand. He looked relieved, his face showing immense pride in his daughter. He knew that the journey they had endured, from the days of fear to this moment, had been one of bravery and resilience. The judge continued, her voice firm and resonant. "The defendant is sentenced to 20 years in prison, without parole or reduced sentencing. This is a fitting punishment for his violent, inhumane acts and his abuse of power. These actions not only betrayed his position and the honor of the police force, but also deeply damaged public trust in the justice system." The judge's final words resonated as a closure to all the suffering and fear Ellie had endured. These powerful words left a lasting impression on everyone in the room. As an officer approached to handcuff Chris Brown, his face lost its former arrogance, replaced by fear and helplessness. He glanced around as if searching for a savior, but all he found was the cold truth that his freedom was slipping away. The image of Chris Brown, once proud and powerful, now facing the consequences of his ruthless actions, left a profound impact on everyone present. For many, it was a clear testament that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. Ellie exhaled deeply, feeling as though the weight of her fears had finally lifted. She looked at Sandra, who had fought tirelessly for her throughout the trial, her eyes shining with gratitude. Sandra, who had given her all, nodded back with a gentle smile. "You stood strong, Ellie," Sandra said quietly. "Justice was achieved not just because of me, but because of your courage." Joseph took his daughter's hand, his voice filled with emotion. I'm so proud of you, Ellie. You didn't just fight for yourself, you fought for everyone who might suffer at the hands of abusers. As they left the courthouse, Richard and Shatner waited outside, the loyal allies who had supported Ellie throughout her pursuit of justice. They saw her emerge with a look of peace, the relief evident in her eyes. Richard stepped forward, admiration clear on his face. Ellie, you did what not everyone dares to do, Richard said firmly. You stood up against injustice and proved that justice can prevail, no matter how difficult it is. Ellie smiled, her heart full of gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you both, Richard. Your support made me stronger. Shatner, his face composed but his eyes filled with pride, nodded in agreement. Ms. Ellie, this is not only your victory, but a victory for everyone who has ever suffered from the abuse of power. You've set a precedent for others to stand up and believe in justice. Outside, the first rays of sunlight touched Ellie's face, as if blessing her. After a long period shrouded in fear and pain, she finally felt true freedom and hope. This light wasn't just illuminating Ellie's path, it was a symbol of hope and renewed faith in justice. In the days following, Ellie's story spread far beyond the local community, appearing in news articles and on social media platforms. Many shared it as a powerful reminder that justice can ultimately prevail and that no one, regardless of their power, can forever hide their wrongdoings. For those who had witnessed injustice or suffered in silence, Ellie's case was a beacon of hope. They felt empowered, believing that their voices could be heard and that the truth, no matter how long it was suppressed, would come to light. Ellie's story became a symbol of resilience and bravery, while many would have chosen silence under the pressure of power. Ellie faced it head-on, not only seeking justice for herself, but also for those who lacked the means to stand up. Her actions touched the hearts of those who had felt powerless, inspiring them to find the courage to fight for truth and justice. Human rights organizations and women's advocacy groups held forums, sharing Ellie's story as a valuable lesson. Participants, from social activists to ordinary citizens, saw that Ellie's struggle wasn't merely a personal victory, but a triumph for all communities striving for truth and fairness. Her story carried a message that society still has those who dare to stand up for what's right, and that justice, when backed by enough faith and unity, will find its way. Ellie's case did not end with the court's verdict but became a source of motivation, a spark that encouraged many others to commit themselves to the fight for justice. Her story continued to be shared in inspirational talks and social media posts, reminding everyone that every voice matters and that each brave action contributes to a better society. For Ellie, she returned to her daily life, but with a renewed outlook. She knew she had overcome a monumental challenge and could take pride in not only defending herself but also in strengthening the belief in justice. Every time she thought of the moment Chris Brown was led away in handcuffs, she felt that the justice she had fought for would forever be a part of her life, a source of strength guiding her forward with faith in fairness and truth. She understood that the battle for justice might never truly end, and that there would always be those who abused their power. But she also knew that the resilience and bravery of people like herself would continue to shine as a guiding light for those seeking truth. After the intense trial, Ellie Taylor began to return to her everyday life. But deep down, she knew she was no longer the same person. She had emerged from a nightmare with newfound strength and determination. The painful memories of the case had become a part of her story, but rather than letting them hold her back, she transformed them into motivation to grow stronger. Ellie felt she had achieved a new sense of freedom, a confidence she had never experienced before. Back in the lab, Ellie resumed her research work. The long hours with scientific equipment and experiments brought her comfort and peace. Yet now her work held a new significance. Every invention and advancement was no longer just a personal achievement, but a testament to human resilience in the face of adversity. Each day, she reminded herself of the battle she had fought, and it spurred her to work harder to create meaningful contributions to the community. For her father, Joseph, life took on a new meaning as well. He was no longer just a self-defense instructor at the community center, but a symbol of strength and perseverance. His classes grew in attendance, with both young people and adults coming to learn how to protect themselves and their families. Each session with Joseph was about more than just defensive techniques. It carried deep lessons about courage and justice. Joseph often recounted Ellie's story during his classes, not to scare, but to remind everyone of the value of determination and inner strength. He wanted his students to understand that, no matter how difficult or unjust the world could be, they had the right to stand up for themselves and their loved ones. His classes became a place where people felt heard and inspired, sharing their own stories and drawing strength from each other. Ellie's relationship with Richard, the young officer who had bravely testified for her, deepened as well. After the trial, they frequently met to discuss life and the challenges of their respective careers. Their conversations were not just personal exchanges, but moments of profound empathy between two people who had faced a grueling trial together. One evening, as they sat at a small cafe under soft lights and gentle music, Richard shared his thoughts. "The trial changed me a lot, Ellie," he said, his gaze distant. "I joined the police force to protect people, but sometimes the system makes me question my original purpose." Ellie gave him a soft smile, replying, "You've truly done that, Richard. You stood by me when no one else would. You proved there are people in the force who still have integrity." They sat together in silence for a while, sharing a deep understanding that needed no words. Richard knew that his decision to stand up against a former colleague was difficult and could affect his career, but he had no regrets. He had chosen the right path, and the admiration in Ellie's eyes only strengthened his resolve. As news of the trial spread, Ellie's story became a topic of conversation in the community. People looked up to her as a symbol of courage and resilience. She had fought not just for herself, but for countless others who had been oppressed or afraid to confront injustice. Newspapers, television programs, and social media shared her story, turning her into a beacon of the fight against abuse of power. Ellie received letters and messages from strangers who shared their stories and expressed gratitude for her bravery. A young woman wrote to Ellie, saying she had experienced a similar situation but felt trapped and too scared to stand up. Inspired by Ellie's courage, she decided to fight for herself. Ellie felt touched and happy to know she had inspired others. Months later, Ellie accepted invitations to speak at community events and seminars, where she shared her story and emphasized the importance of protecting justice. She stressed that, no matter how tough the circumstances, everyone has the right to stand up for what is right. Her words touched the hearts of hundreds of listeners, and she felt a sense of change slowly unfolding. At a special seminar, standing before a packed audience, Ellie felt both nervous and deeply moved. "I was once afraid, thinking I wasn't strong enough to face what happened," she began, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. "But I learned that strength isn't always about physical power or status. True strength comes from a determination to stand against injustice." Sitting in the audience, Richard watched Ellie with pride. He knew she was not only a courageous woman, but also a living inspiration for the community. They both knew that their journey was far from over, but they also knew they weren't alone. They had found in each other empathy, support, and an unyielding spirit. When the seminar ended, many people approached Ellie to shake her hand and congratulate her. They thanked her for inspiring them and for showing that justice could indeed be achieved. Ellie smiled and responded to each person, feeling her heart fill with happiness and gratitude. The battle she had fought was not in vain. It had brought hope and faith to herself and those around her. As they walked home after the seminar, under the street lights and the quiet of the city, Ellie and Richard both felt that, while her journey had brought justice, there were still many out there who needed help. Ellie took a deep breath, feeling peace and determination settle within her. "Richard," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I want to keep doing this, not just for myself but for others. There are so many people out there who need help, who need someone to stand with them." Richard nodded, his eyes shining with solidarity. "I'll be here, Ellie. We'll do it together." With every step they took toward home, Ellie and Richard knew that their fight would never truly end. But they also knew that as long as they stood by each other and continued to defend what was right, they would make a positive impact on the community. And in the quiet night, they felt the strength of justice, unwavering determination, and an unbreakable belief guiding them forward. After the series of seminars, meetings, and shared stories, Ellie Taylor felt she had become part of a larger change, a quiet but powerful movement to bring justice for all. Today, she and her father, Joseph, returned to the courthouse for the final time to wrap up the remaining formalities. They stepped out of the courthouse feeling both relief and determination. Though justice had been served, Ellie knew her journey was far from over. Her case was not just a personal victory, but a beacon of hope in a system filled with challenges. On the walk back from the courthouse, they moved through the starlit night, the sparkling sky symbolizing hope, a hope that truth would spread and reach others also seeking justice. Joseph paused, looking at his daughter, and shared his long-held thoughts. "Ellie," he said, his voice thoughtful and full of meaning, "this battle won't be the last time you face challenges. Changing the system is a long road, sometimes taking years, even generations. But every time someone dares to stand up, like you have, the power of truth multiplies." Ellie listened quietly, taking in her father's words. She understood that fighting for justice is not something that could be accomplished overnight, and that it required persistence and immense courage. She knew she was not only fighting for herself, but also for those who had experienced injustice and had yet to find their own voice. Looking at her father, she grasped his warm hand, replying, "Dad, I realize I have a bigger responsibility. I want my story to remind others that they are not alone and that there's always hope. I'll keep fighting, not just for myself, but for everyone who has been hurt, left behind." Joseph nodded, his eyes reflecting pride and trust. "I believe you will, Ellie. You've overcome more than anyone I know, and I'm proud not just of the person you've become, but of your unshakable spirit." They continued walking, and Ellie felt the journey had changed her profoundly. She had once been afraid and doubted herself, but now, after all, she had endured. She had grown stronger, not just in will, but in her determination to become a voice for those less powerful. Her steps were no longer just for her survival, but a contribution to a larger change, a change she believed could make the world safer and fairer. Behind them, Richard and Sandra remained outside the courthouse, watching the father-daughter pair with admiration. Sandra turned to Richard, holding his hand, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Ellie has truly changed our understanding of justice. It's not just about one person, but about resilience and the power of courage. Richard nodded, his eyes alight with conviction. Yes, her story isn't just a case, it's a symbol for those brave enough to stand up and demand what's right. Ellie showed us that sometimes even one person can make a huge difference. Ellie's story spread quickly, not just within her community but across the country. Newspapers, TV features, and social media began to discuss her as a symbol of bravery. Many people drew strength from her story, finding encouragement in her determined journey. Ellie received hundreds of letters and messages from individuals who had faced similar situations but lacked the courage to stand up. Some women who had experienced abuses of power wrote to thank her for showing them they were not alone in their struggles. Ellie understood that her responsibility was not only to live her life, but also to advocate for change. She began participating in community events where she shared her experience and the importance of not giving up. At every event, she reminded everyone that justice, though it might take time, always existed, and they were never alone in their journey. One evening, as Ellie and Richard walked around her old neighborhood, they gazed up at the night sky. Richard spoke, his voice full of feeling. "Ellie, I'll never forget that trial or your resilience. I had once questioned justice, but you helped me believe in it again." Ellie smiled, her eyes shining under the stars. "Thank you, Richard, not only for what you did for me, but for the courage you showed. You helped me see that there are indeed people in the system who stand for justice." They walked together, deeply understanding that they were not only allies in a case, but true friends who had found a connection through adversity. They knew that while the journey was not easy, it was worth it. On this journey, Ellie realized that change doesn't only come from grand actions, but from small, everyday steps. She continued her research in the lab with renewed purpose. Each project she worked on became another way to contribute to the community and the change she hoped for. As time passed, Ellie and Richard found that the memory of what Ellie had gone through and her fight for justice had left a deep imprint on both of them. After the trial concluded, they realized that Ellie's story had sparked hope and a sense of social responsibility in many others. They saw this not only as a personal victory, but also as the beginning of a larger mission. This realization led them to the idea of forming a support group for people who had faced injustices. Together, Ellie and Richard founded a nonprofit organization, calling it The Journey for Justice, to help those who had been hurt by injustice. They wanted to create a safe space where people could share their stories, find empathy, and seek solutions together. They understood that being able to speak out and be heard was the first step toward healing and restoring faith in themselves and society. Each week, Ellie and Richard organized small gatherings at a community center, inviting those who wanted to share their stories. Initially, the group was small, with only a few members who had heard Ellie's story and sought her out, feeling a deep sense of empathy. They came from different backgrounds but shared a common sense of abandonment and neglect by the system or society. Ellie listened patiently, with deep empathy, as she understood well the feeling of losing faith in justice and having to fight alone to reclaim fairness. In one of the early meetings, a woman named Maria, with a sad but hopeful gaze, shared her story of being unfairly dismissed from her job. She felt powerless and unsure of how to fight for her rights. As she listened, Ellie saw herself in Maria, the woman who once stood alone in the face of injustice, unsure of what to do, and without anyone to stand by her. Ellie gently told Maria, "You don't have to go through this alone. We'll help you find your voice again." Richard, with his knowledge and experience in the legal field, offered legal guidance and support to members facing legal challenges. He provided materials, detailed information about their rights, and necessary steps to protect themselves against injustice. With Richard's support, many in the group gradually regained confidence and started taking action to reclaim their rights. Over time, their organization began attracting the attention of other groups, and the Journey for Justice soon became a broad network. They connected with lawyers, psychologists, and volunteers who were willing to listen and support. Each member contributed something small, but every action, no matter how modest, added to the strength of their community. Beyond sharing sessions and legal support, Ellie and Richard organized workshops, inviting people who had overcome their pain and succeeded in seeking justice to share their stories. These workshops not only inspired the members but also motivated them to keep fighting. One man, Jack, who had suffered harassment at work but didn't know how to speak up, found the courage to sue his company and reclaim his rights after attending a workshop. Jack shared, "I used to think I was too insignificant to change anything. But thanks to Ellie and everyone, I realized that I deserve fair treatment." Stories like Jack's, Maria's, and many others created a ripple effect. From those initial meetings with just a few people, the Journey for Justice grew into an organization with hundreds of members. Stories shared in the group gradually spread, encouraging many outside the community to step out of the shadows of silence and helplessness. Victims of injustice, who once thought their voices wouldn't make a difference now, had a place to lean on, a platform to speak up, and the knowledge that they were not alone. Ellie, though still carrying scars from her own fight, found healing through each story shared within the group. She realized that her journey didn't end with the trial, but continued every day as she supported others. Together with Richard, she felt she was contributing to building a more just society. Looking back, Ellie knew that the injustice she had once suffered had created an invisible strength, connecting her with others whose voices had been forgotten. She told herself that if each day she could help someone regain their faith and their voice, then everything she had gone through would have been worthwhile. The Journey for Justice became more than just an organization. It became a part of Ellie and Richard's lives, a source of strength for those who felt weak, and a place where people could find empathy and courage to keep fighting. Both of them knew the journey would not be easy, but they were ready to face it because they believed that justice, no matter how overlooked, would always find its way. One day, as the sun was setting and the last light of day was fading, Ellie stood by the river, watching the water flow gently under the evening glow. The world around her was quiet, with only the soft rustling of the trees and the distant murmur of the water. This was one of the rare moments she allowed herself to pause, to reflect on the long journey she had endured. She heard quiet footsteps approaching. It was Joseph, her father. He came to stand by her side without saying a word, simply sharing the stillness of the moment. They both stood there in silence, each immersed in the beauty of the scene, feeling the steady flow of the river, much like the flow of time through their lives, filled with inevitable highs and lows. Finally, Joseph spoke softly, his voice warm and full of pride. "Ellie, you've done something many thought was impossible. You not only won justice for yourself, but you've also spread the power of what's right to so many others. You've made me proud." Ellie turned to her father, her eyes brimming with love and gratitude. "Thank you, Dad," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Without you, without your guidance and faith, I don't know if I would have made it through." Joseph placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple yet warm gesture conveying all the words he didn't need to say out loud. To him, Ellie wasn't just his daughter, but a companion on a journey of justice and truth. He had watched her grow from a young, innocent girl into a strong, determined woman with deep compassion. The two of them stood side by side, not needing many words, simply feeling the bond of family and the powerful faith in truth and justice. They had faced so many hardships together, and as they stood under the twilight sky, they both understood that the journey was far from over. But now, they no longer felt alone, knowing that by their side stood a community of people who had found hope and strength in Ellie's story. As night fell, the sky became clear, and stars began to appear, shimmering brightly and illuminating the path they walked. Ellie looked up at the night sky, feeling a deep connection with the stars. Those sparkling lights felt like a reminder that no matter how difficult the journey, there would always be a guiding light, that justice and truth would always be present, no matter how many challenges had to be overcome. Father and daughter turned to head home, their hearts full of determination. Under the shimmering stars, they walked in silence. Not a silence of sadness or exhaustion, but one of resolve, of a powerful belief that they were on the right path. They knew that each step mattered, that they were helping to build a better world where justice wasn't a distant concept, but a fundamental right, a belief everyone could rely on. Ellie Taylor's story is not just a journey to reclaim justice for herself, but a source of inspiration for everyone who has been oppressed by power and injustice. What do you think of Richard's decision to stand against a colleague to uphold justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and meaningful stories. See you in the next video.